It all began on an ordinary Friday evening in a bustling Atlanta neighborhood where sirens whirred and fluorescent lights flickered against a deepening twilight. A city that had seen it all yet had never quite seen anything like what was about to unfold. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The hum of traffic, the murmur of pedestrians outside a Starbucks, the distant bark of dogs in the park. But beneath the veneer of routine life, an injustice was quietly taking shape. A black woman, singled out and cornered by a police officer determined to ruin her life, found herself ensnared in a sinister trap. Little did he know surveillance footage would blow the entire scheme apart. Keisha Adams never thought her life would change so drastically on an otherwise unremarkable day. She was a 29-year-old social worker living in the Summerhill district of Atlanta. She had grown up in the heart of the city, surrounded by both the beauty of its cultural tapestry and the harsh realities that lurked in some neighborhoods. Her daily routine was simple: wake up early, brew a cup of coffee, and brave the ever-present Atlanta traffic to get to the neighborhood community center where she worked. There, she spent her days counseling young teens, many of whom struggled with broken homes, limited resources, or academic obstacles. She loved her job. It gave her a sense of purpose, a feeling that she was contributing in a small but vital way to the future of her community. That Friday, Keisha's day began much like all the others. She dressed in a simple grey blouse and black slacks, grabbed her bag, and left her small but cozy apartment. On her way to the center, she decided to make a quick stop at Starbucks, one of those chain locations housed in a refurbished brick building on the edge of downtown. Despite her better judgment about saving money, she still loved the sweet taste of a caramel macchiato once in a while. The line was long, which was typical for a Friday morning, but Keisha didn't mind. She passed the time by thinking about her busy day ahead. She had 3 counseling sessions lined up, each with high school kids who faced unique challenges. For some, she provided mentorship. For others, resources to handle homelessness or violence in the home. In every case, she did what she could, although the demands of the job often left her exhausted. She was just about to finalize her order when she felt something or someone bump her shoulder. She turned around to see a tall, clean-shaven police officer with steely grey eyes staring at her with a mix of disapproval and irritation. "Excuse me," the officer said, in a tone that was anything but apologetic. His name tag read Officer Timothy Brandt, a new face in her part of town, though she had seen him around the neighborhood in recent weeks. She'd heard rumors from local teens about how he pulled people over for the smallest infractions. Some said he had a heavy hand on the trigger of his authority. Still, as far as Keisha knew, he'd never specifically targeted her or the center. That was about to change. "It's fine," Keisha replied politely, stepping aside, but the officer didn't move on. Instead, he stood in line behind her, eyes scanning her up and down. She felt his gaze like a cold wind on the back of her neck. Something about the tension in the air made her uneasy. The moment was fleeting, though, and soon she was at the counter, placing her order. By the time she picked up her drink, she'd dismissed the incident as a minor brush with an abrasive personality, nothing more. She couldn't have been more wrong. Keisha's workday flew by in a blur. She counseled a 15-year-old boy who was on the verge of dropping out of school. She helped a teenage mother find housing assistance. She guided a bright, ambitious girl through college application forms. By the time she wrapped up her final session, she was exhausted but satisfied. As she locked up her office, she noticed a strange tension in the halls. 2 uniformed police officers were talking to the community center's director. She recognized neither of them, but their presence felt unsettling. When she approached the director, Miss S. Flanagan, to ask what was happening, the elderly woman simply shook her head in dismay. "They're asking if we've seen anyone suspicious around the neighborhood," Mrs. Flanagan whispered. "Vandalism, apparently." Keisha glanced back at the officers. Both had the same no-nonsense posture, hands resting lightly on their belts. Something about their stance or expression made her stomach knot. She quickly said her goodbyes, collected her things, and left through the main entrance. Outside, the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The city's lights began to flicker awake, and Keisha prepared herself for the drive home. She had only walked a block when she noticed a police cruiser trailing slowly behind her. She turned onto a side street, only to see the cruiser turn as well. She wasn't speeding or doing anything illegal, so she tried to brush off the sense of dread. However, after a few more minutes of this silent escort, her heart pounded. Finally, the police lights flashed, and the short siren whoop forced her to pull over. She rummaged in her purse for her driver's license and registration, her mind racing. She hoped it was just a random stop, maybe a broken taillight, but deep down she feared it was something more. As the officer approached her driver's window, she recognized him immediately. Officer Brandt, the same man she had encountered at Starbucks that morning. "Good evening," he said, his tone clipped. "License and registration, please." She handed over her documents, trying to keep her composure. "Is there a problem, officer?" Brandt shone his flashlight across her front seat, momentarily blinding her with its glare. "We have a report of suspicious activity near the community center. Do you work there?" "Yes," Keisha answered, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm a social worker." He examined her driver's license. "A few people matching your description have been reported loitering in restricted areas." It was vague, ominous, and made no sense. Keisha had never heard of any restricted areas around the center. "I haven't been anywhere suspicious," she said. "I left work and walked straight here." Brandt's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "Well, we'll see about that. Step out of the car, please." Her heart thundered, but she complied. Another patrol car arrived, and a second officer, someone she didn't recognize, watched from the sidewalk. Brandt led her to the back of her car. "What's in your trunk, Miss Adams?" he asked, flicking his flashlight at the rear of the vehicle. "Just some brochures and supplies for the community center," she answered, her throat suddenly dry. Brandt pulled on the trunk handle. It was locked. "Open it." She swallowed hard. Although she knew she had nothing to hide, the intensity in his voice rattled her. Still, she clicked her key fob to unlock the trunk. The officer rifled through a box of pamphlets about mental health and after-school programs. Brandt looked up, something unreadable in his eyes. "Where were you between 5 and 6 p.m.? "I was still at work, finishing counseling sessions." He stared at her for a moment, then took a step back. "We've had complaints. Keep your nose clean." Without waiting for a response, he slammed her trunk shut and walked away, returning to his cruiser. Keisha felt her knees weaken with relief, though her heart still hammered in her chest. She watched as both patrol cars drove off, their red and blue lights fading into the distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that Officer Brandt was hunting for something that simply didn't exist. Over the next week, Keisha tried to return to normal life, but the tension lingered like a dark cloud. She couldn't shake the unsettling memory of Brandt's gaze, the sense that he was looking at her like a predator sizing up prey. Meanwhile, the community center buzzed with whispered rumors. Other staff members mentioned seeing Brandt prowling around the building, questioning people about possible drug deals, vandalism, or trespassing. Some local teens told Keisha that Brandt had cornered them in an alley, demanding to know if they had connections to any gang activity. The kids were terrified. None of them had any knowledge of such crimes. One afternoon, Keisha discovered a note taped to her office door. "He's watching you." That was all it said. No signature, no further explanation. She stared at the words, her heart pounding with dread. But why would he target her? She had done nothing wrong. She was a social worker, devoted to helping her community. It made no sense. That evening, After all the staff and kids had gone, Keisha stayed late to organize some new materials. As she stacked booklets on the shelf, she heard the sound of footsteps echo down the empty hallway. Her instincts bristled. She called out, but no one answered. The echo grew louder until, suddenly, she saw the shape of a person in uniform outside her doorway. It was Brandt, wearing an expression that was equal parts smug and threatening. "Working late, Miss Adams?" he asked, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "Yes. Is there something I can help you with?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked around the office, letting his gaze linger on the shelves of pamphlets and the posters that promoted community outreach programs. "We've had reports that someone's using this center as a front to distribute illegal substances." Keisha's jaw dropped. "What? That's absurd." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of cologne. "I don't think so. We found remnants of narcotics in the alley right behind this building. Word on the street is that a staff member might be involved." He let the accusation linger in the air. "Someone who has access to the facility. Are you suggesting that I'm distributing drugs?" Keisha's voice broke with anger. Brandt shrugged. "I'm just doing my job, following leads. But if I find out that you or anyone else here is involved, I will make sure you pay the price." His eyes bore into her, filled with suspicion, but beneath that, Keisha sensed something else, a hunger to see her fall. In that moment, she realized it wasn't about justice for him. It was something personal, some twisted desire to assert power. "You have no evidence," she said, crossing her arms. "I will," he replied ominously, before turning on his heel and disappearing into the hallway. Keisha sank into her office chair, her mind racing. She had to figure out what was driving this man to target her, and more importantly, how to protect herself and her reputation before it was too late. Rumors spread quickly in a small community. Within days, whispers of a drug ring at the center started swirling around. Parents grew nervous. Attendance at the after-school programs dipped. Some of Keisha's colleagues gave her wary looks, though no one openly accused her of anything. Still, she could sense the unease. All the while, Brandt kept popping up outside the center, at a nearby convenience store where she sometimes bought snacks, even once at her apartment complex parking lot in the dead of night. Whenever she saw him, her stomach twisted in anxiety. He'd offer a mock greeting, tip his hat, or do something equally insincere just to remind her that he was there, watching. She reported the harassment to the local precinct, but nothing came of it. When she tried to file a complaint, the desk sergeant frowned and told her that Brandt was one of their own, highly respected, and just doing his job. Her complaint seemed to fall on deaf ears. "I don't know what to do, Mama," Keisha confided to her mother over Sunday brunch at their family home in Lithonia. She'd decided to visit, hoping for the comfort of home, cooked food, and maternal wisdom. Her mother, a retired nurse with a stern but caring face, patted her hand. "You have to fight this, baby. Document everything, every encounter, every time he stops you, write it down." Her father, a stoic man of few words, merely nodded in agreement. "And find someone who can vouch for you if it comes down to it." Keisha took their advice to heart. She began meticulously noting every interaction, every odd look or insinuation. But the tension weighed on her. She found it hard to sleep, often plagued by nightmares of being cornered by Brandt in a dark alley. The breaking point came one late afternoon when Keisha was driving home from work. She pulled into a gas station on Peachtree Street, one of those hectic corners where cars constantly jockey for position. As she stepped out of her car to pump gas, a police cruiser screeched into the lot, lights flashing. Officer Brandt and another officer jumped out, guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them," Brandt shouted. Keisha froze, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. She slowly raised her hands, her mind whirling in disbelief. The other officer grabbed her roughly by the arm and pinned her against the side of her car. She could feel the metal nozzle still in her hand, trembling. "What's going on?" she gasped. Brandt gritted his teeth, a twisted look of triumph on his face. "We received a tip that you're in possession of stolen prescription medications and plan to distribute them." Keisha's eyes went wide. "That's insane. I have no idea what you're talking about." But Brandt was already yanking open her car doors, rummaging through the glove compartment, scanning under the seats. He threw open the trunk, tossing her personal belongings around as if searching for something very specific. She could feel eyes on her other customers watching, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. After a few tense minutes, Brandt straightened up, his expression triumphant. In his hand, he held a small plastic bag of pills. Keisha's heart plummeted. She had never seen them before. She was certain they weren't hers, yet here they were, in her trunk, in the officer's hand. "You're under arrest," Brandt declared, eyes gleaming. "Possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute." A flurry of confusion and protest erupted from Keisha's lips, but it was no use. Cuffs were snapped around her wrists, and she was pushed into the back of the cruiser. She felt humiliatingly helpless, like a character in a nightmare she couldn't escape. What followed was a whirlwind of procedural nightmares. Keisha was booked at the local precinct, her fingerprints taken, her mugshot captured under harsh fluorescent lights. She was charged with felony possession of a controlled substance. Throughout it all, she kept insisting on her innocence, insisting that she had been framed, but her claims fell on deaf ears. To make matters worse, Brandt's police report stated that he had credible intelligence from an anonymous informant tying her to drug distribution. As soon as that language appeared in the official record, Keisha realized how carefully Brandt had orchestrated this. Her world began to crumble. She was suspended from her job at the community center, pending the outcome of the charges. Her colleagues, though some believed her, were powerless to intervene. Many community members who had once respected her started to question whether the rumors might be true. Was she really using her position at the center to peddle drugs? For some, it was easier to believe the official narrative than to entertain the possibility of a corrupt cop. She managed to post bail with the help of her parents, but the damage was done. The system had been set in motion. She was due to appear in court, and a conviction would spell the end of everything she'd worked for: her career, her reputation, even her freedom. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Keisha turned to the one friend she knew might offer practical help: Michael Patterson, a local civil rights attorney who had grown up in the same neighborhood. They'd met years ago when Michael volunteered at the community center, offering free legal advice to families in need. He was sharp, passionate, and unafraid to take on the system. Sitting in Michael's modest office, Keisha recounted every detail, starting from the bizarre Starbucks encounter to the arrest at the gas station. Michael listened intently, taking furious notes. "Do you have any idea why he might be targeting you specifically?" Michael asked, leaning forward in his chair. Keisha shook her head, tears threatening to fall. "I wish I knew. It feels so personal. He has this look in his eye, like he wants to punish me for something." Michael frowned. "It doesn't make sense on the surface. But I've seen cases like this before, especially involving black men and women. Sometimes cops target someone because they think it'll be an easy arrest or because they have some vendetta. Sometimes they're just trying to pad their numbers to look good, or maybe there's an even deeper motive we don't yet see." He tapped his pen against the notepad. "We need evidence that you were framed. Without it, the system will take Brandt's word over yours." Keisha's shoulders slumped. "I don't know what else I can do." Michael gave her a reassuring smile. "Let me look into this." In the meantime, gather any surveillance footage, witness statements, anything that might prove you were nowhere near those pills before he claimed to find them. That gave her an idea. She recalled that the gas station had multiple security cameras. She also remembered a young woman in the parking lot that day who had her phone out, possibly recording. If any of them captured the moment Brandt discovered the pills, maybe it would show him planting the evidence. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. With Michael's help, Keisha obtained the gas station's surveillance footage. The manager, a kind middle-aged man named Mr. Banerjee, was cooperative once he learned of the situation. It took some time to sift through the relevant portion, but when they finally located the clip that showed Officer Brandt searching her trunk, their initial excitement fizzled. The trunk area was too far from the camera's main focus. The angle wasn't clear enough to confirm or deny whether Brandt had placed the bag of pills there himself. Still, the footage did reveal something interesting. Brandt opened the trunk, rummaged around for a few seconds, then briefly stepped out of the camera's frame. When he reappeared, he was holding the plastic bag. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it seemed suspicious. Why would he step away from the trunk for just a moment? They also couldn't locate the bystander who might have filmed the incident on her phone. The partial license plate they'd noted on her car didn't yield a quick lead. As the court date loomed closer, Keisha's anxiety grew. She knew that in the eyes of many, she was already guilty. The justice system could be a punishing machine, especially for a black woman. Even if acquitted, the social stigma could linger for the rest of her life. One late evening, Keisha was home, sifting through her notes of all the suspicious encounters with Brandt. Her phone rang. The caller ID was unknown. She nearly let it go to voicemail, but something compelled her to pick up. "Hello?" A hesitant female voice spoke. "Is this Keisha Adams?" Keisha's pulse quickened. "Yes." Who is this?" There was a pause. "My name is Officer Jenna Riley. I work at the same precinct as Officer Brandt. I need to talk to you." Keisha's skepticism flared. "Why?" Officer Riley hesitated. Then her words rushed out, as though she feared losing her nerve. "I've seen some of the reports he's filed. I think he's lying, and I think you've been set up." "I can't say more over the phone. Can we meet?" Shock and a sliver of hope mingled in Keisha's heart. "Yes. Where?" They agreed to meet in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, somewhere neither would be easily recognized. That next night, Keisha slipped into a corner booth, her nerves aflame. A few minutes later, a tall, athletic woman in plain clothes entered, scanning the room. When their eyes met, the woman approached and slid into the seat across from her. "You're Officer Riley?" Keisha asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman nodded. "I can't stay long. If Brandt or his friends find out I'm here, it won't be good." "Why are you doing this?" Keisha asked. She still wasn't sure if this might be a setup. Officer Riley exhaled slowly, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "Brandt has a reputation. He has a history of finding drugs on suspects, usually people of color. I've never been able to prove anything, but I've seen enough to know something is off. He's careful, but not perfect. Why hasn't anyone reported him?" Riley's lips pressed into a thin line. "Our captain is more interested in boosting arrest records than investigating a potentially corrupt cop. Plus, Brandt has connections with an influential union rep. We all know stepping out of line could end our careers, or worse." Keisha shuddered. "What can you do?" Riley reached into her jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. She slid it across the table. "Brandt submitted some dashcam footage for your arrest. I was able to intercept a higher quality version from the internal server. It's not conclusive on its own, but it might raise enough questions to help your attorney." Keisha's hands shook as she took the drive. "Thank you," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. Riley nodded, her expression filled with guilt. "I wish I could do more, but for now, that's all I can risk. I'm sorry." There's something else you should know. There's talk that Brandt used to date a woman from your community center and that things ended badly. It's possible he's holding a grudge against anyone associated with that place, or maybe he just likes the power trip. But you need to be very careful. He's not above playing dirty. With that, Riley stood, gave Keisha a solemn look, and left the diner. Keisha clutched the USB drive as though it were a lifeline. Back at Michael's office, Keisha and the attorney hurriedly plugged the USB drive into his computer. The dashcam footage was far clearer than what the precinct had originally provided to the defense. They saw the moment when Brandt pulled into the gas station, lights flashing. The camera angle caught Keisha's face as she stood next to her car, bewildered and scared. Then it showed Brandt conducting a search of her trunk. The crucial piece of footage came when he glanced around, reached into his belt area just out of the main angle, but still somewhat visible, and appeared to retrieve something. He then bent into the trunk again. Moments later, he emerged with the bag of pills in hand. Michael paused and rewound the video multiple times, analyzing each frame. "He's planting it," Michael said, hardly able to contain his excitement. You can't see the bag in his hand before he reaches into the trunk, but you can see the motion of him pulling something from his belt. If we slow it down and enhance it, we might be able to make it even clearer. Keisha stared at the screen, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks. Here was evidence, tangible proof that she had been framed. Michael quickly made multiple backups of the footage. They would need to present this in court, but they also had to ensure it wouldn't mysteriously disappear. Armed with this new evidence, Michael filed a motion to dismiss the charges. The prosecution resisted, claiming the footage wasn't definitive, but Michael insisted on playing it in front of the judge during a preliminary hearing. In the silent courtroom, the dashcam footage rolled. Officer Brandt's face was clearly visible. The subtle motion of his hand, retrieving something near his belt, was undeniable if you looked closely. A hush fell over the courtroom as the video ended. Then Michael played it again, this time in slow motion. Several jurors who were attending this session as part of the selection process leaned forward. The judge frowned, her eyes narrowing at the screen. When the court recessed, Brandt was conspicuously absent. No longer was he cocky and triumphant. In fact, he'd taken sick leave, according to the official record. Gossip around the precinct suggested he was trying to figure out damage control. Still, the fight wasn't over. The prosecution insisted it needed time to analyze the footage and verify its authenticity. The judge granted them a brief continuance, yet the tide was turning. Media outlets began picking up on the story. Social worker claims she was framed by Atlanta police officer, and local activists started rallying behind Keisha, demanding transparency and justice. While the dashcam footage was compelling, it was still somewhat open to interpretation. The defense needed a final nail in the coffin, something beyond question. Fate intervened in the form of a local store owner named Mr. Nguyen. He ran a small market across the street from that very gas station. Mr. Nguyen came forward with additional surveillance footage from the outside camera of his store. While the angle was distant, it showed the back of Brandt's cruiser, the side of Keisha's car, and a partial view of Brandt's movements. In that footage, Brandt's action of slipping a small packet from his belt was even clearer. He was in profile. It was the final piece of the puzzle, lining up perfectly with the dashcam footage from Officer Riley's USB. Together, the two videos were a damning portrait of a cop planting evidence. When Michael presented this second piece of footage, the prosecution's case collapsed like a house of cards. Within days, all charges against Keisha were dropped. The district attorney's office announced that an internal affairs investigation into Officer Brandt was underway. Keisha's name was officially cleared, but the turmoil she had experienced was far from forgotten. Keisha walked out of the courthouse that afternoon under bright sunshine. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. She felt a whirlwind of emotions: relief, anger, vindication, exhaustion. Michael guided her past the throng of media to a waiting car. In the days that followed, the scandal grew. The story made local headlines, with some national attention creeping in. Atlanta officer accused of planting evidence on innocent social worker. Internal Affairs questioned every arrest Brandt had made in the past 2 years. Lawsuits began cropping up from other victims who claimed they too were framed or harassed by Brandt. Eventually, the hammer fell. Officer Timothy Brandt was fired from the Atlanta Police Department. Worse for him, the district attorney brought criminal charges against him for perjury, obstruction of justice, and falsifying evidence. When investigators dug deeper, they found text messages that hinted Brandt had a personal vendetta against Keisha and the community center, fueled by a past relationship gone sour and a deep-seated prejudice. As Brandt sat in a defendant's chair, facing the very justice system he had abused, Keisha felt a sense of catharsis. The man who tried to destroy her life was now on the receiving end of the law's wrath. In court, Brandt looked smaller, quieter. Gone was the smug bravado. Now, he was just another disgraced officer in a suit, fighting to stay out of prison. With her record wiped clean, Keisha returned to her job at the community center. The staff greeted her with hugs and tears of gratitude, apologizing for the doubts they had harbored. Over time, attendance at the center rebounded as parents realized the rumors of a drug ring were just that, rumors. Keisha's story became a rallying point, leading to community forums on police accountability, racial bias, and the importance of proper checks and balances within law enforcement. She was invited to speak at town halls and universities, sharing her ordeal and urging for systemic changes. Though she felt uncomfortable with the spotlight, she recognized the importance of her voice. She knew hers was far from the only case where an officer might abuse authority. If telling her story could prevent even one more person from going through a similar nightmare, it was worth it. Months turned into a year, and Keisha gradually reclaimed her life. She found a new resolve in her work, doubling down on her efforts to mentor at-risk youth. She partnered with Michael on a pro bono legal clinic where they worked together to guide teens towards safer, brighter futures. In her personal life, the scars of Brandt's harassment and arrest attempt lingered. She attended therapy to cope with the anxiety and lingering sense of vulnerability. But piece by piece, she rebuilt her confidence. The nightmares subsided, replaced by a steely determination to remain active in local reform movements. Officer Jenna Riley, who had risked her career to help Keisha, quietly transferred to another precinct. She and Keisha stayed in touch, occasionally meeting for coffee. Riley admitted she sometimes feared retribution from Brandt's allies, but she never regretted doing the right thing. Their unlikely friendship became a testament to the fact that not all cops were corrupt. Some were brave enough to stand against injustice, even within their own ranks. Meanwhile, Brandt's trial made headlines. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty of multiple counts, including obstruction of justice and falsifying evidence. His sentencing was a moment of eerie satisfaction for many who had been wronged by him. Though no one celebrated his downfall with glee, there was a collective sense that karma had indeed come around. On a bright afternoon, exactly 1 year after the charges against her were dropped, Keisha stood on the steps of the community center, gazing at a mural painted by neighborhood kids. It depicted a phoenix rising from the ashes, surrounded by symbols of unity and hope. She smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. In her hands, she held a new set of brochures for her counseling program, expanded now, thanks to a grant she'd secured for at-risk youth. Life had moved forward, and so had she, stronger and more resolute than before. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the air, a soft reminder that despite the darkness she had faced, goodness still thrived. She walked inside, ready to greet a new group of students. Her life's mission was clearer now, to ensure that no one, especially young people of color, ever felt as helpless and alone as she had during her ordeal. Yes, the wheels of justice had turned, albeit slowly and grudgingly. But in the end, truth prevailed. And as Keisha led a group of wide-eyed teenagers through the center's halls, she offered them not just guidance, but a lesson in resilience, showing them that even when you stand alone, integrity can light a path through the darkest times. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed how one woman's nightmare turned into a powerful triumph of truth over lies. Keisha Adams's journey is a stark reminder that injustices can happen anywhere, to anyone, even those who dedicate their lives to serving their communities. But it's also a story of hope, of individuals who stand up, speak out, and refuse to let corruption win. Officer Brandt learned the hard way that actions have consequences. Sometimes karma doesn't just knock on your door, it kicks it right down. And while this story highlights one broken system's flaws, it also shines a light on the goodness that emerges when people unite for what's right. If Keisha's story moved you, please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to stay tuned for more gripping tales. Together, let's ensure every voice is heard, every truth is revealed, and every injustice is brought to light.